Michael Burry is massively buying Chinese stocks. While everyone is distracted by AI stocks such as Nvidia, Michael Burry is doing something absolutely different. He's going into the entirely different direction and buying massively Chinese stocks. It really reminds me of what he did back in the year of 2000s. Remember when everybody was buying a house, when everybody was actually imagining that the housing market will keep growing, and that's how we actually got a housing bubble. And Michael Burry, even back then, did absolutely opposite thing when he started betting against the housing market, which is the largest market in the United States. And when he shorted the housing market, a lot of those financial institutions looked at him and they thought that he's a fool, because who would actually bet against the largest market, not just in the United States, but literally all across the globe? The US economy is the largest economy out there, and the housing market is the backbone of that economy. So if that backbone of the economy fails, the entire global financial system is going to melt down. That is the consequences that nobody could ever thought that will happen. But Michael Burry did his math, his calculations, and he clearly saw that what's going on in the housing market right now is something that is not sustainable at all. He looked at the numbers and he's like, so many people actually got a house without putting a down payment, and now they are not able to afford those houses, and house prices are way overvalued. And he did his bet and he made over $1 billion for his investors. So if you kind of look at the ROI, that's almost 500%, which makes it, to be honest, frankly speaking, one of the best investments out there. Imagine making over $1 billion. And Michael Burry wasn't really like Warren Buffett. He wasn't sitting in so much cash. And here he is taking advantage of the opportunity and making so much money. Now, you probably have watched the movie The Big Short, and if you hadn't, go and watch that movie. It's one of the most interesting financial movies out there, because it illustrates the entire point of how Michael Burry actually put that bet, and how people in JP Morgan, people in Chase, people in other, like in Lehman Brothers especially, that mocked him for doing something like that. And here he is making so much money. And at the end of 2008, Lehman Brothers, that existed for over 100 years, did not exist at all. And that tells you the power of actually waiting for the opportunity and jumping in and buying stocks when everybody is selling. That's the power of actually knowing what's going on in the market. Now, a lot of people can't possibly do that because a lot of people are not experts at investing, but his investing philosophy is so great that it's basically buy when there is blood in the streets. And that's one of the most popular quotes that was actually mentioned by Nathan Rothschild. Now, there's a lot of conspiracies around the family, the Rothschild family, because they have built back in the days the world's largest financial institution, the Rothschild Bank. That was basically the backbone of the European economy back in the days. Of course, the Rothschild family and the Rothschild net worth has shrunk dramatically since then, because other competitors such as JP Morgan, and today we have like the crypto that took over the entire thing. But back in the days, that's how Nathan Rothschild built entire wealth. He would look at the crises that are happening in Europe or all across the world probably, but primarily between France and England, because these two countries have always waged war against each other, and he would make a fortune out of it. Of course, the family lost a lot during the next few centuries, but the mentality behind it is very simple. When you look at the market and you see so much nonsense is happening, so much crisis is happening, a lot of people, they don't know what's going on. A lot of people are really bad at analyzing stocks. So not just analyzing stocks, people are just bad at understanding the reality, understanding what's going on in the market. So that scares them off, and they will start massively selling everything they have. They want to sell it because they look at prices and the value of, for example, of their house is going down. What am I supposed to do? I'm going to get rid of my house. Look at the businesses. If everything is going down, it's better to sell my business today before things will get significantly worse than they have already got. But that's how crises work. There is a period when things get so bad that you have to be patient. And when you see your competitors are panicking, what you do is that you buy what they have. And when the crisis is over, those things will recover their value and will keep growing. Now, a good example I can give you is probably the 2008 financial crisis. Now, I'm not saying that selling your house was really a terrible idea back in the days, but take a look at the house prices. Back in 2008, house prices, the median house price was like less than $300,000, probably like $280,000. at the peak of 2008. Today, they are double than that. The median house price is like $420,000. And that's how Michael Burry approached investing. And if you take a look at the relationship between China and the United States, these two economies are deeply interconnected with each other. So what happens in one economy strongly affects the other economy. And the relationship between them is like the US is the big brother and China is the younger brother. So what happens, so United States has too much leverage over the Chinese economy, and China has pretty much a lot of leverage as well against the US economy. So if you want to understand what's happening over here, you have to take a look at the relationship between these two countries. And they haven't been really great, especially since Trump became president in 2016 and launched a trade war. And that trade war literally pushed back the Chinese economy. And that's why a lot of US companies, a lot of foreign investors, a lot of hedge fund managers, all of them started kind of drifting away from China and bringing that money to the United States. Especially when we have a real crisis around the globe, do you know what investors usually do? They will take all of their money, bring them to the United States. They will start buying massively US government bonds. They will start investing in the United States or turning them into cash and keeping them in the US. Because there is a very simple mentality in the world of finance that when we have a crisis and the future is uncertain and the level of uncertainty starts rising, what do? You start getting your cash, your investments into the safest possible place for you not to lose it. And that safe place is the United States. So while everybody is bringing things out, Michael Burry is doing the absolute opposite. So in 2020, COVID starts and people don't know what's happening. And you have the president of the United States literally officially declaring it a China crisis, which worsens the situation of the relationship between these two countries. Now, after that, the US fighter jet shuts down a Chinese spy balloon. Now, the situation got worse. The relationship between the two countries is already bad. And now we have shooting down a Chinese spy balloon which worsened the situation between the two countries. Now, would you in your right mind actually invest in Chinese stocks knowing that there could possibly be a full war between the two superpowers? Well, absolutely not. And then the trade war gets significantly worse. Now, a lot of people say that Trump started the trade war with China back in 2016. But a lot of people don't know that when Biden became the president of the US, he did not just continue the policies that Trump had with China, but rather he enforced even more policies. He pushed more tariffs against Chinese products. I think if 2021 and 2022 and especially 2023, there has been more tariffs imposed on Chinese products out there. And if you listen to the president of the US, he would continuously mention the fact that they need to bring manufacturing from China back to the United States. That is the goal they set in front of them. So when you hear all of that, what do you want to do? You don't want to go to China. Nobody wants to invest and risk their investments in China. Now, if that was not enough, we had a lot of news around the fact that China wants to bring back Taiwan into the mainland. And this is not just news. This is because President Xi, the leader of China, announced at one of their meetings with the Chinese Communist Party declaring that China will do everything possible to bring back Taiwan to the mainland. It's going to be either economically and diplomatically, or if that does not work, China is ready to take military action to bring back Taiwan. That video is literally here at YouTube. So when you hear news such as like that, what do you think? When a war takes place in that country, you don't want to invest in that country because you don't know how that war will actually turn out to be. And the situation with Russia showed us a lot that the West is ready to isolate any country that would not actually follow its rules. So they isolated the entire Russia, and pretty much 99% of all foreign companies, probably 100% of all Western companies left Russia when the invasion actually started back in 2022. And a lot of investors are afraid that something like that could possibly happen if China invades Taiwan. Why would you invest in such a country? You should not do something like that. It is too risky. And if that wasn't enough, then a lot of companies suddenly start leaving China. They start taking action to exit China because they're not sure how the situation will unfold. If the relationship keeps worsening, it's better for us to diversify. So you have Apple, you have Nike, you have Starbucks, you have Boeing. You have a very long list of companies that are leaving China, going to India, going to Vietnam, bringing back manufacturing to the United States. And that, guess what effect that had on the Chinese economy? It slowed down the Chinese economy, and it's very clear on the data that you see, because China is barely struggling to achieve the 5% growth. That is if you don't count the 2022 when we had the global pandemic, then it is probably the slowest economic growth in the entire history of China since China opened up its doors to the rest of the world and adopted capitalism since like early 1970s. So that is a clear sign that yes, we had an 8, 10 or 12% GDP growth over the last 50 years, but that period is over and we can barely hit 5%. And for China not to hit even 5% is catastrophically bad for one single reason. China is not yet a developed country, which means that it does not have a GDP per capita of like $40,000-$50,000 at least match the UK. I'm not even talking about the United States. The US GDP per capita is like what? $80,000, and the Chinese GDP per capita is like $14,000. So there is a lot of room to grow for China still, but because its economy is slowing down and not growing by at least like 7 or 8%, and now we have all of these US companies leaving China, what does that mean for the future of China? But even though that we had so much news, so many reasons for the US investors or any other foreign investor to leave China, what do you think is happening in this environment? People like Michael Burry look at this situation, they're like, this is exactly the definition of buy when there is blood in the streets, especially if you understand China and you understand the Chinese stock market. So even though we had all of this situation that's happening over here, what Michael Burry does is that he jumps in and he starts massively buying Alibaba stocks. In the third quarter of 2023, he first of all purchased 50,000 shares of Alibaba. On the fourth quarter of 2023, he purchased another 25,000 shares, bringing his total shares to 75,000 shares. And he also purchased some shares out there in the first quarter of 2024. So which amounted his total investments in this company, $9 million. And now look at what's happening over here. If you take a look at the growth, it has grown by 41% from the end of last year to the peak of 2024. But if he actually purchased some of his stocks, for example, at the beginning of 2024, those stocks have increased by at least 50%, if not more than that. And that's a great investment, given the fact that nobody wants to invest in Alibaba right now. Because if you know anything about China, is that China interferes in Chinese companies inside the country. So if the Communist Party does not like you, they can literally just kidnap you the next morning, and that's the end of your company. Like, take a look at Alibaba. Alibaba was founded by Jack Ma, one of the most, if not the most famous entrepreneur of China. And he said some of the things in an interview back in the United States that the Chinese Communist Party did not like. First of all, they kicked him out of Alibaba. They stopped his IPO of Ant Group that he's supposed to do back in those days. And then they cracked down his entire company. And if you look at the stock performance during like 2020, 2021, you will see that it's actually falling down significantly. And nobody in his right mind would invest in such a company knowing that, the Chinese Communist Party can come back and actually do something else that would actually hijack probably the current CEO. Maybe they're having some kind of misunderstanding. Who knows what's happening between those people? And yet, Michael Burry is going in and buying Alibaba stocks during this period, and now his investments has grown by at least 40%. I'm not sure if he actually sold at the peak, but I assume that he sold at that point at least some of his stocks and made like 40 to 50% on his investment. Now, another stock that Michael Burry has purchased was JD.com. JD is very similar to Alibaba, and it's an e-commerce website. And between the fourth quarter of 2023 and the first quarter of 2024, he has purchased 360,000 shares worth an estimated amount of almost $10 million. And this investment turned out to be even better than Alibaba, because all of those stocks that he purchased, for example, at the end of the last year has grown by at least 86%. But if you actually take the stocks that he purchased during the first quarter of 2024, then they probably most likely has increased by at least 100%, if not more than that, because we can only take a look at the data from the filings to the SEC by his company, which is Design Management Capital. But we can't really know for a fact which were the exact dates that he actually purchased. So I assume that he already has sold some of his stock during this period. Maybe he has kept some of them. Maybe he has at least more hope that this stock will actually continue rising to a certain extent. So even though that we can see that the relationship between the two countries, and it seems from the news that you see that China is actually collapsing and the Chinese economy is growing some of the worst periods out there, he is actually making millions of dollars by buying Chinese stocks. And the interesting thing about it is that he purchased the stocks during this period, and most people thought that he is an idiot. Why would you buy Chinese stock? But then he waited long enough until the end of the year, until the stock starts rising, and he has doubled his money, at least with this company, JD.com. And now that actually leads me to the next very natural question. Why was Michael Burry so confident in his investments? And in order to be so confident, you have to understand a thing or two about China. China is a communist country with a capitalistic economy. And what you have to understand about China is that China is very obsessed with GDP, because there is some kind of a social contract between the Chinese Communist Party, who's ruling China, and the Chinese people. The party is like, we're actually restricting a certain level of your freedoms, but in return, we are going to use that in order to ensure that China grows consistently over the years and China becomes the largest economy out there. So that represents in the GDP growth of every single year that is presented by the Chinese Communist Party. Now, some people might say that those growth are not always extremely accurate, but they must be accurate to a certain extent, given the fact that if you just go back like to 60s and 70s, you'll find out China was one of the smallest economies out there. And even if you go to 1960s and 70s, the financial situation was so bad in the country that 50,000 people died of famine because they simply couldn't afford to put food on the table. And the Soviet experts will come from Moscow to China in order to teach Chinese people how to structure their economy, how to structure their country, how to be more effective, and at least make sure that nobody's actually dying out of hunger. That's how bad the situation was in the country back in the days. So when they go from something like that to what they have today, which is the second largest economy, they're leading the world in EVs, they're leading the world in solar energy, they're leading the world in a lot of other technologies, and they have already overtaken the United States in multiple fields. And I'm not even talking about the European Union, because it seems like the rest of the world is growing, but the European Union together with the United Kingdom are literally just sleeping out there and trying to figure out why on earth they even exist in the world. Anyways, he understands that there is an obsession by the Chinese Communist Party when it comes to the GDP growth. So he probably anticipated that if China is not going to hit a 5% GDP growth rate this year in 2024, then they are going to do something about it in order to ensure that happens, especially when there have been a lot of bankruptcies like in 2020 and 2021 when it comes especially with the real estate crisis. So the Chinese Communist Party this year started suddenly throwing stimulus checks into the economy by giving very cheap loans to the companies that have their stocks listed in the stock market and trying to stimulate the economy so that it actually grows, and the Chinese Communist Party hits the 5% target rate that they have set in front of them. Especially when it comes to China is determined to overtake the United States as the largest economy out there. Now, that might not happen this year, it might not happen next year, it might not even happen in the next 5 years, but China has all the chances. They have all the resources, they have all the population, they have the size, they literally have everything in order maybe not even overtake the United States, but at least stand on the same level as the United States. And Michael Burry understands that even though that this crisis that happened in 2020 damage China's economy significantly, it doesn't mean that there is no room for him to actually make some money, especially in the stock market, especially when we talk about short periods of time, such as 6 months, 1 year, or 2 years, something like that. And China does not want to repeat the exact same experience, for example, as Japan did. Because if you go back to 1980s and 90s, people talked a lot about Japan overtaking the United States. But the difference between and right now they're comparing that the slowdown of China is very similar to the slowdown of Japan. And if you take a look at the numbers and the data, it looks exactly like that. But the main difference is that back in 1980s, they have agreed with the United States to devalue the dollar, and that was one of the major reasons that crushed the Japanese economy. And Japan was very heavily dependent on the United States, especially on security, and it had no other choice. Now compare that to China, that is expanding its military massively and does not want to listen to the United States, and is actually leading its own foreign policy and is not a puppet of the United States. So if it means to actually crush the United States in the middle of actually overtaking it, then that is going to be one of the consequences of those decisions. Now, the main thing is that will the market in China crush? That is the most interesting question. How long Michael Burry wants to stay in this market until the market crushes? Will that happen tomorrow? Will that happen by the end of the year? Maybe next year? Well, I believe that the Chinese market, the growth that we see in the Chinese market is very short period. It's not going to last very long. I'm not saying that everything is going to collapse in China, but because we had a lot of government money flooding into the economy, a lot of those stocks started growing significantly. Now, remember what happened in the United States back in early or the mid of 2020 when a lot of those stimulus checks and low interest rates actually flooded the market with cheap money. A lot of stocks that even didn't have any kind of real value started growing. And one of the great examples I can give you is probably Nikola stock, which was literally a worthless company, but because it had a cool name and an inflow of cheap money into the market, and that company skyrocketed its stock, and a lot of people actually made money out of it. It was a very short period thing. I'm not saying that Chinese stocks will end up like the Nikola stock, but the fact is that that kind of stimulus checks usually grows the market substantially over a very short period of time, and then investors start massively selling off their stocks when they've actually made their profit, and they realize their profits, which means that a period of selling starts and the stock will go down. Now, the economy might actually keep growing after that. That stock in the long run might actually keep growing, but in the short run, those stocks will fall. So I think that Michael Burry's actually made a really great bet to actually make money in the short period of time, because that's what he's known for. That's exactly how he made his money in every single crisis out there. But it doesn't mean that he's going to stay a long-term investor in all those stocks, especially knowing that nobody knows what's going to happen with China and US relationships. Nobody knows how the situation is going to unfold when these two giants are actually competing with each other. But what I know for a fact is that there are still going to be opportunities to make money in the stock market. The reason that Michael Burry could actually anticipate and make this investment is purely because he understands how the market works. Remember, investing is not gambling. It's not like he just randomly picks some stocks and that's why those stocks suddenly started growing. That's not the case. There are reasons, and the better you understand the market, the better you can actually make investment decisions. I understand that most people cannot possibly do that because mastering any skill takes years, if not decades. And that's why most people either never start investing, or even if they do, they never do it effectively. But if you want to get really good at investing in a month or two and learn how to make your first $100,000 in the stock market, then check out the first link in the description. Thanks guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.